Professor Dan Jocelyn Simitowski. I'm the director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, and I am the Kraft Family Professor at Boston College. And I am very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today with Dr. Alan Shore. And so let me introduce you to him. Dr. Shore has lectured widely in the United States and abroad on various forms of Jewish-Christian relations. He is a native of New York City, but went all the way across the country and got a PhD in modern Jewish history and culture from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, where I first made his acquaintance. Today, Alan Shore will be speaking with us about his recent book, Uncommon Allies. I have a copy of it here for you to see. It's a very handsome and well-done book. This book is a confluence of his abiding interest in New York Jewish history, the American Jewish experience, Jewish-Christian relations, and Yiddish language and culture. As I have read through Uncommon Allies, I found that it provides a really valuable addition to our understanding of the development of Christian-Jewish relations in the United States in this period before and during the Shoah. Its narration of interreligious collaboration and mutual aid between Jews and Christians also offers valuable insights for us today. By way of process, Alan Shore will be presenting for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there'll be a period of question and answer, which I'll be fielding the questions to him. At any point during the webinar, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat, and I will pose them to him as I am able. So I am pleased again to welcome Alan Shore and to hand things over to him.
So thank you for the opportunity to present my work. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Dan, who was my dissertation advisor and guided me to a successful defense with a considerable amount of expertise and patience. So before I talk about my work, let me tell you a little bit about how I got to it in the first place. I didn't enter this line of scholarship en route to a career in academia. It came about as a logical extension of the convergence of developing interests throughout my life that Dan mentioned a little earlier. So as a native New Yorker from the borough of Queens, from the time I could put a subway token in the turnstile, I was off to the magical land of Manhattan, where the museums were, Central Park, and the diverse, fascinating passing parade of people. I developed a love of New York City that never abated. And in time, I started showing out-of-town visitors around, giving walking tours of the Lower East Side, the epicenter of New York Jewish immigrant history, as something of an homage to my own background, pointing out this and that along the way. But, you know, there came a point where it was all very well, but I became more and more aware of what I considered to be wide gaps in my knowledge. And eventually, I returned to my studies, not to advance a career, as I say, but what is termed in the Hebrew language Torah Lishma, which can mean learning for its own sake. So from the first, I discovered I was wrong about having large gaps in my knowledge. Not so. What I actually had were very narrow gaps in my ignorance. But by the time I finished, I brought together my love of New York City, its history, a commitment to Jewish heritage, growing interest in interfaith relations, and a developing delight in Yiddish language study, which persists to this day. So with all that in mind, why a book? Of making many books, there is no end. Okay. But as I was once advised, write about the things you care about. Well, I already had those. But then if you can, upset some received and prevailing wisdom, not just with a new theory, but with concrete facts to back it up. As I understood it, this is what good research is supposed to do. Broaden understanding, uncover overlooked evidence, and perhaps upset a few apple carts along the way. So at approximately the same moment, I became aware of the first Madison Square Garden protest rally in 1933. I found the apple cart that I wanted to overturn. And it was that the conventional wisdom that placed the real beginning of meaningful Jewish Christian relations in America in the years following World War II was misguided. Now, that position is succinctly stated by the late eminent philosopher, Jewish educator, and specialist in Jewish Christian relations, Dr. Michael Wischergrad, in his paper, Orthodox Judaism and Jewish Christian Dialogue, delivered, coincidentally, on January the 28th, 1986, at a conference of the Rabbinical Council of America. So he asserted, quote, for several decades now, Jews have participated in Jewish Christian dialogue. Prior to World War II, this was hardly an issue. There simply was not anywhere in the world organized and sustained contact between the Jewish community and church bodies. Here and there, individual Jews may have had personal contact with a minister, a priest, or some church personality, but this was strictly personal rather than organizational. The fact is that after World War II, a process of reassessment of Jews and Judaism began to make itself felt in the churches. Unquote. So, as a result of this construction of events, instances of interreligious exchange and cooperation during the years leading up to and including World War II have been widely ignored by religious and secular scholars alike. My work makes the case that not only was there far more than casual contact here and there between individual well-meaning Christians and Jews, but the organizational relationships Dr. Wischergrad and those who share his view dismiss out of existence until after the war's conclusion were well under development not only during the war, but from the first days of the Hitler regime and even earlier. This omission from the historical record has allowed a false account of American Jewish Christian relations to become entrenched when the facts point in quite the opposite direction. My aim is to show that the story of the construction of Jewish Christian discourse in America is more complex and, frankly, far more interesting than we have been given to understand. So, to get started, in the early months of 1933, credible and disturbing reports began to leak out of Nazi Germany concerning a spreading pattern of depredations directed against Germany's Jewish populace. Deeply concerned, in only 9 days, the eminent Rabbi Stephen Wise was able to assemble a program and to secure the storied Madison Square Garden for an evening of protest that took place on March 27th, 1933. And the image that you're seeing on your screen now is a photograph of that image at Madison Square Garden on that evening. It was natural for Wise, in his dual roles of honorary president of the American Jewish Congress and reform rabbi of the Free Synagogue of New York City, he had founded in 1907, to take a leading part, for he was a widely respected Jewish leader. He was also no stranger to non-Jewish readers of the English language press, who regarded him as a reliable spokesman for Jewish interests. In his dual role, okay, there he is, Stephen Wise, addressing the world on March the 27th, 1933, at Madison Square Garden. And the rally was a resounding success in terms of attendance and coverage in both the English and Yiddish language newspapers. And there's that. The day following, New York Times' largest headline proclaimed 55,000 here stage protest. Hitler attacks on Jews. And Wise's speech was quoted at length, as were those of noted New York politicians who, mindful of the importance of their Jewish constituency, would not miss the opportunity to lend their support to an event unfolding at the epicenter of Jewish life in America. However, an additional element was present that would have been less familiar to the public. placed under the subheading Other Faiths Join In, and you can see that. This angle of the Times story went on to describe how an assembly of well-respected Christian clergy was also present that evening to lend their voices to the message that Hitler's treatment of the German Jews must not be countenanced by the silence of Christian America. The public utterances of Christian speechmakers that evening went even further, turning the spotlight on anti-Semitism in America, the importance of which had been suddenly and dramatically amplified by Germany's shameful treatment of its Jewish citizens. This, in and of itself, represents a dramatic turning point. In constructing a case against Nazi ideology and its mistreatment of the Jews, Christian representatives found themselves forced to condemn American anti-Semitism, if for no other reason than to provide a contrast with the Nazis. So the logic went something like this: the Nazis are godless. We Americans are godly. The Nazis are evil. We Americans are good. The Nazi anti-Semites hate and persecute the Jews. Now, therefore, godly, good Americans must love and protect the Jews? Well, that seems a tall order. But to do so, they were forced and faced with the challenge of navigating a whole new terrain of interfaith discourse and coming up with a whole new vocabulary with which to articulate this novel concept. And I don't want to belabor this right now, but I go into it and make the case that I believe this is when the concept of Judeo-Christian values and its ties to American patriotism that reaches its full bloom in the Cold War begins to germinate. So the appearance of these leading Christians at the rally did not materialize out of thin air. Like calls to like, for they were the result of Wise's cumulative efforts, who for decades had planted the seeds of interreligious cooperation focused on poor social conditions and other social gospel concerns among like-minded Christian clergy, beginning with his first rabbinate in Portland, Oregon in 1900. Now it seems his efforts were coming to fruition. Some American Christians were publicly vocalizing united opposition not only to the deteriorating situation of the German Jews, but to the concept of anti-Semitism itself, and shrewdly pushing these well-known Christian representatives and politicians to the front of the stage early on. Wise's own speechifying would gain increased credibility because it carried the imprimatur of the predominant mainline Christian establishment. The press coverage of the meeting was extensive, conveying a sense of immediacy and drama available nowhere else. Journalism also provided me with a treasure trove of primary materials in both the English and Yiddish language press about the events, and extensive quotes from the text of both Christian and Jewish speechmakers in both languages. Primary sources nested in primary sources. What researcher could ask for more? I was very fortunate here. In addition, English and language media coverage offered some striking contrasts. The English and Yiddish journalists were watching the same event, but they were definitely not seeing the same thing. One example is that the aura of reverence that surrounded the English language press coverage of Stephen Wise certainly did not extend to every sector of the Yiddish press. Ideological rifts were rampant among Jews, no surprise there, and their differences were colorfully explicated in the vigorous Yiddish press of the time. Wise had intentionally shut out the Jewish communists from the platform, deeming them a severe liability, and the communists' Morgen Freiheit, that is, morning freedom, coverage of the rally was therefore less than enthusiastic, let us say. Plus, the Yiddish papers could speak to their readership in a far more candid and unfiltered way in their own language. In another publication, Ben Zion Kohlberg, the son-in-law of the beloved Sholem Aleichem, wrote a lengthy and somewhat sarcastic piece that actually lampooned the program and some of its speakers. Now, we must pause to remember here that this was only 1933, some years before the full impact of Hitler's program would be felt, when a far greater sense of desperation would ensue. Goldberg's first observations was that it was a great wonder that somehow not only do the Yiddish speakers understand the English speeches and vice versa, not only that, they are all able to applaud at the right places. He also noted with some amusement the number of non-Jews present on the platform, observing what a delight it was to be a goy on the platform, but finally conceding, go no, where a little Torah will turn up. Still, the Yiddish press covered the rally generously with some particularly striking photojournalism. This is just one of the inside pages of the Yiddish, the Daily Forwards, and there is the picture that Syracuse University Press, I think very wisely chose for the cover, and there it is right there in the Yiddish press. Now, not all American Jewish organizations were on board with the rally and its attendant publicity. The well-established and influential Jewish Committee, American Jewish Committee, which in the manner of the advocacy of the old court Jews of Europe sought to bring about results through their advocacy that was quiet and behind the scenes in the corridors of power, they abhorred what they perceived as Stephen Wise's freewheeling, attention-grabbing approach. They also strenuously opposed Wise's proposed boycott of German goods, claiming it would hurt German Jews, an objection echoed by German leadership itself, which begged Wise to desist. Their fears turned out to be well-founded, for under Hitler's orders, Germany implemented a boycott of Jewish businesses, physicians, and attorneys a mere 5 days later on April the 1st, for which the American Jewish Committee bitterly blamed the March 27 protests. Conditions in Germany continued to deteriorate for German Jews in 1933, and concrete action by the Roosevelt administration, which had offered only vague assurances, failed to materialize. Regardless, swift follow-through from Christian churches and organizations was forthcoming in terms of further public expressions of support, which resulted in the strengthening of relations between Jewish and Christian representatives who had participated in the March 27th protests or were otherwise sympathetic with their aim. On May the 26th, the Times carried a petition composed by the highly influential Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick of the Riverside Church in Manhattan, which was signed by approximately 1,200 Protestant ministers, including prominent figures, clergy members from 42 states and Canada. And at least as important, the rally and its aftermath had a significant afterlife that laid the foundation for other interfaith developments throughout the period. Neither did the more reticent American Jewish Committee sit still. Also in 1933, it abruptly reversed its long-standing policy of holding Christian representatives at arm's length. Prior to the 1930s, Cyrus Adler, an AJC founding member, had actively discouraged the possibility of interfaith cooperation, unable or unwilling to see, quote, what possible advantage can come from making the Christian clergymen and the Christian religious press acquainted with the organization of our committee, unquote. That position no longer held. True to its established methodology, the AJC stressed education, educating the public through its publications. And here we have, this is a publication called The Voice of Religion, which issued supportive statements on behalf of Jews. It was a 31-page pamphlet that was a compilation of supportive statements on behalf of Jews and along a far broader spectrum, ideological and theological spectrum of Christianity that Stephen Wise had been able to assemble through his liberal contacts at Madison Square Garden at the rally on March 27th. And they contain some statements that some readers of this work might find surprising. And I'm just going to read one of them. So this comes from the Epworth League. The Epworth League was established under the auspices of the Methodist Episcopal denomination. It conceived its mission to be a more thorough enlistment of young Christians in Christ's work. So its publication, the Epworth Herald, published an article called Jew and Gentile. And turning to the specific attitude with which Christians ought to regard the positions of the Jews vis-a-vis the Christian faith, the article declared, "It will help us to realize that Jesus was a Jew. Perhaps we ought to have a ritual in our churches which would make us declare, along with the Apostles' Creed, the fact that Jesus was born of a Jewish mother, raised in a Jewish home, went to a Jewish synagogue, and worshiped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A proper reading of the New Testament, the Old Testament, and of history would make it easier for us to give the Jewish people the honor they deserve." So, in proposing a more pronounced liturgical recognition for the Jewishness of Jesus, the Herald offered, for its time, a startling blurring of the borders from the Christian side. But it wasn't only Christians who were trying to figure out how to talk about and to Jews. Jews were trying to figure out the key to unlocking Christian sympathy. And one inroad had to do with tapping into the oldest Jewish Christian convergence in America, one that predates even the 20th century, and that is Christian support for the aspirations of the Zionist movement. A full year before Stephen Wise organized the first Madison Square Garden event, Zionist leader Emanuel Newman was tasked to tackle the work of garnering the endorsements of influential Protestant Americans on behalf of the Zionist cause. He began with a small but powerful group of politicians, which convened on January 17, 1932, to announce the formation of the American Palestine Committee. United States Vice President Charles Curtis presided over the event, and a distinguished group of Jewish and non-Jewish leaders attended. One of the highlights of the evening came when Newman read a letter from President Hoover which voiced support, quote, "in favor of the realization of the age-old aspiration of the Jewish people for the restoration of their national homeland," unquote. Jewish Zionists began to rediscover how they could use the sympathetic, religiously based disposition of some Christians toward Zionist goals as a card played to advantage. The common cause that Jewish and Christian Zionists found in the Nazi era, despite the disparate reasons for their interest in each other, provides a fresh insight into the nature of Jewish-Christian encounter. For example, Newman's memory of a remark that William Hopkins, a former city manager of Cleveland, reinforces the element of growing Jewish awareness and appreciation of the powerful hold that even the term Zion could exert upon the religious imagination of even nominal Christians, provided the seed had been properly sown. In Newman's recollection, Hopkins opined, "We are most likely to gain supporters among a certain type of Christians who have been brought up on the scriptures, who have a sentimental and emotional attitude toward the Holy Land, which makes them predisposed to favor the Zionist cause." Hopkins' astute thinking did not stop there, as he went on to warn the company not to depend too much upon, quote, "politicians and liberals who have no such background and sentimental attachment to Palestine," unquote. And I would say that his assessment of the staying power of both groups in support of the Zionist cause has proven to be prescient. So, bringing this summary of the first of the four rallies I cover in the book, I want to read just a little bit from the conclusion of my first chapter. Wise's mission resembles that of another, earlier Jewish rabbi who sought to be a guardian of his people, the Maharal of Prague, with whom the legend of the Golem has become most closely associated. This tale, which has found an enduring place in literature, the stage, and film, tells of how, in a moment of intense danger to the Jewish community, the rabbi fashioned a powerful figure from river clay and brought it to life to protect his people. Animated by the word emet, truth, engraved on its forehead, the golem was controlled by a shem, a magical formula placed in its mouth. Thus, although unpredictable, the golem could be programmed to follow simple instructions. It was, however, prone to erratic behavior. In drawing together the reliable voices of Christian clergy and other non-Jewish worthies, Stephen Wise attempted to fashion a golem from the clay of our national culture and place a set of instructions in its mouth. He was determined to amplify his intentions by deploying the power of the American Christian establishment on behalf of his vulnerable co-religionists abroad. Wise is deemed a failure by his detractors with regard to the fate of European Jewry. If that is true, perhaps it is partly because his golem's behavior proved in the end to be as unreliable as that of its predecessor in Prague. So as not to overburden my time, I'm going to shift somewhat abruptly, shift in decades to explore a bit of the complexities created by the tendencies of human nature. We are now in the 1940s, in the middle of the war. Stephen Wise is still a major figure, but not nearly the firebrand that he had been. For one thing, he had fallen under the spell of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who either had or had pretended to bring Wise somewhat into his inner circle. There is still controversy about how much influence Wise actually wielded, but there is no doubt that Wise was caught between his desire not to embarrass Roosevelt and his administration and the criticism emanating from his fellow Jews that he was not being vocal enough. Another thing, it seems that Wise had begun to think of himself as the authoritative voice that spoke for American Jews. But when has there ever been such a thing? In fact, there was another Jewish group in particular that was fast emerging that would give Wise fits. And these were the assertive, militant, revisionist Zionists founded by Vladimir, aka Ze'ev Jabotinsky, excuse me, whose goals included not only a Jewish homeland, but also the creation of an independent Jewish army to fight the Axis powers, to rescue and repatriate European Jews in Palestine, and a Jewish nation whose territorial borders included what is today the nation of Jordan. On a tour in the US to raise support, Jabotinsky was accompanied by a deputy, Hillel Cook, also known as Peter Bergson, and when Jabotinsky died suddenly of a heart attack in New York State, the young Bergson, who was then only in his late 20s, continued on, founding the Committee for a Jewish Army of Stateless and Palestinian Jews. Not surprisingly, such a provocation was anathema to Wise. Then, at a fateful meeting with A-list Hollywood screenwriter Ben Hecht, see if we can do that, good, whose credits include The Front Page, Scarface, Gunga Din, and a host of other highly successful films at the 21 Club, a renowned watering hole in Manhattan, Bergson tapped into the slumbering passion of Hecht, who had been up to that point a merely indifferent Jew. Now deeply committed to publicizing the revisionist cause, Hecht turned to a form from which he was quite familiar, the theatrical pageant, patriotic pageant with which he had already had resounding success on Broadway. He wrote a script, brought in composer Kurt Weill, best known for the three-penny opera, who with his wife, the actress Lotte Lenya, had fled Germany in 1933. Hecht then managed to recruit enough of his Broadway and Hollywood cohorts, including Paul Muni, Edward G. Robinson, Stella and Luther Adler, John Garfield, Paul Einried, remember him from Casablanca, and Sylvia Sidney, among others, to fill out the cast for the premiere of the pageant We Will Never Die, a full-throated cry for recognition, justice, and respect at Madison Square Garden on March 9th, 1943. But there was a potential complication. In Hecht's recollection, Stephen Wise had somehow gotten hold of a script of We Will Never Die and called to inform Hecht that it was unacceptable that Hecht should cancel the pageant and that he should cease working for the Jewish cause independent of Wise's supervision. But bad blood had already existed between Wise and Hecht for some time. In his autobiography, A Child of the Century, Hecht recounts his first encounter with Wise, with whom he had approached some time earlier at the behest of his aunt to obtain Wise's services to officiate the burial of his mother. Wise agreed to do so for a fee of $5,000 to, as he explained, cover the cost of the pew. Hecht said he didn't want to join the synagogue, he just wanted to get his mother buried. Wise was adamant, and Hecht made other arrangements. Though needless to say, this left a bad taste in Hecht's mouth, and not surprisingly, it was Wise's demands that turned out to be unacceptable. The ideological and personal differences between Wise and the revisionists would culminate in dueling Madison Square Garden rallies on successive weeks in March 1943. The first, held on March 2nd, was sponsored by Wise and his organization, was dubbed Stop Hitler Now. Now, at this point, it was already well known that the eradication of the Jewish population in Europe was well underway, with, at this point, about 2 million people who had been gassed or shot or otherwise done away with. So this rally was dubbed Stop Hitler Now. It was deemed successful, well attended, well covered by the press. It stuck to the tried and true Wise playbook, speechifying by politicians and clergy, followed up by Jewish speakers, highlighted by Wise. But We Will Never Die received far more extravagant coverage than Stop Hitler Now, particularly in the New York English language press. Moreover, ticket sales for the pageant were so brisk that for the first time ever, 2 performances of the same piece were performed back-to-back at the Garden that night, the first at 8:45 and the second at 11:15 p.m. There it was, an extravaganza. 40,000 here to view Memorial to Jews, highlighting the 2 million that had been slain already, and there is the set. So the pageant went on to play in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Chicago, culminating in another sold-out performance at the Hollywood Bowl on March the 21st. Stop Hitler Now and We Will Never Die share much in common. Both had the same goal of motivating the public to urge the Roosevelt administration and its allies to take concrete steps to avert the full measure of destruction. Despite these similarities, the contrast in the style and the substance of their respective approaches reveal widely different understandings of the nature of Jewish identity, both in itself and in connection to others. Both bear the stamp of their originators, their priorities, their strengths, and their limitations. Stop Hitler Now portrays Jews as helpless victims and as supplicants to those more powerful than they. Its plea for intervention is based primarily upon an appeal to civilized values, which Jews played an integral role in creating and which ought to motivate the world to come to their rescue. But by once again deploying politicians and Christian clergy to make their case, Wise and his Jewish colleagues created a protective cover under which Jewish speakers could operate, confident that their messages would not sound too strident or otherwise strike a discordant note. By contrast, We Will Never Die adopts a far more defiant tone. This is the program cover for the Madison Square Garden premiere, which was also used in the venues elsewhere. It was created by the internationally renowned Polish-Jewish artist Arthur Szyk, who styled himself a soldier in art, who, Hecht wrote, worked tirelessly for the revisionist cause for 8 years without compensation, promoting for better, or for worse, or for both, the image of the fighting Jew. We Will Never Die does not look to others for approval to validate its message. Instead, the Jewish presence is front and center, with Christians in a minor and supplementary role. It is less an appeal to the conscience of the world and far more an unambiguous demand. It defiantly asserts that Jews are entitled to exercise the same fighting instincts for survival as any other national group. Its message to the wider world is not merely a request for aid based on the finer elements of enlightened values. It is that the Jews, in no uncertain terms, are owed justice, which includes the right to fight for themselves. And we have in our time seen the fighting Jews in ways that Stephen Wise or even Ben Hecht might never have imagined. This is one of my favorites. This is Franz Waxman, a Hollywood composer with a list of credits twice as long as your arm, including 2 Academy Awards and 12 nominations. Here he is rehearsing the orchestra at the Hollywood Bowl presentation. I had quite a job tracking down his son, now in his 80s, who gave me permission to use this image. Fast forward to now. Once again, American anti-Semitism, long assumed to be, if not dead, at least dormant, has sprung into newly revived virulence, sometimes, but not always, I concede, cloaked in criticism of Israel's prosecution of the war in Gaza. Once again, Jewish people need allies. Once again, Jews are turning to Christians to help make the case that this is a serious problem that must be addressed. Once again, Jewish organizations are seeking allies in the Christian world to form common cause in a way that is eerily similar to what began to happen in 1933. Only this time it is taking place right here in America. But where are these allies to be sought and where are they to be found? One thing that is increasingly clear is that they are not to be found among the groups where Stephen Wise found them, among elite learning institutions of higher education, for example. While once these could be safely counted in the corner of Jewish support, the past year has taught us that this is presently, emphatically, not the case. The same erosion of support for Jews is evident in progressive political and even ecclesiastical circles. At one time, such people were thoroughly dependable. Judging by the array of politicians and clergy Wise was able to assemble on such short notice in 1933. That too has changed. There is much more to be said, but I'll stop here. More than one person has told me that this book appears at a timely moment. And it makes me think of the words of William Faulkner, who once said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop the share. Shall I do that?
Yes, please.
All right. And there it is.
Good. Well,
And
thank
here I
you.
am.
Good. Well, thank you, Alan, for offering us this uh, look at your book and the main claims. I welcome people to enter their questions, whether large or small, into the book. Um, I, I, I have a number of thoughts about what you've been saying as I've been reading and reflecting on the book. I think I would start perhaps going back towards the beginning is with, I think, the first chapter where there's this framing of American Christians are being called to confront godless Nazi anti-Semitism. It's claimed that that is inimical to American values and even somewhat to Christian values. In that process, do you see those Christians who are participating in these early rallies to be already beginning an assessment of Christian anti-Semitism? Have they yet really excavated what's happening within their own tradition? Or are they mostly focused on this sort of projection and reaction to what they're framing as a kind of pagan Nazi anti-Semitism?
That's an excellent question. And yes, I mean, let's just say this, that the soil had already been turned, in some traditions of, self-reflection, about anti-Semitism. And it is interesting that many of the statements that come out against the statements that come out against anti-Semitism seem to me to fall into two camps. And the first, along the more liberal points of the ideological spectrum of Christianity, the emphasis is on civilized, enlightened values. And these are the people, as I mentioned in the talk, like calls to like. These are the people that Wise had cultivated. These were the people that he had most in common with among the Christian, spectrum, ideological spectrum. But there, as you move along the spectrum, you find, especially in this book, The Voice of Religion, a genuine self-examination that I think had been taking place along the way. Certainly, the stimulus of Nazi persecution in Germany was the stimulus that galvanized these statements. You had 1,200 clergymen signing a petition, and all of this was taking place very, very quickly in 1933. So there had to have been some self-examination along these lines that was
Mhm.
already going on.
Right. And one of the things you talk about in your book is the goodwill movement, and which appears to be happening more in the 1920s. Can you just fill in the gap about what that is as one of the precursors?
Yeah, the FCC, I talk about this quite a bit in the book. There was a Rabbi Landman. They were
Can you just briefly say what the FCC is? It's
Oh,
not the
Federal
thing.
Council of Churches. There was movement within, kind of a God squad of Christian clergy and a Rabbi Landsman that was moving this along. So again, this was the germination, another seed that was germinating in this discussion that was in the 1920s, the Goodwill movement, the FCC. But there was a problem. Jewish organizations were very, very wary, as the American Jewish Committee was, of associating with Christian organizations because the Jewish organizations were deeply suspicious that this attempt at goodwill was just simply a subterfuge to cloak missionizing of the Jews.
Mhm.
So if you want to play in our sandbox, you have to play with our rules. So these Christian organizations had to really, really double down and emphasize that we are going to lay down our tracts, that in no uncertain terms, we are making a commitment to you not to attempt to missionize you.
Mhm.
And there were the NAE, National Association of Evangelicals. Some of this was impetus for the NAE churches to exit from the Federal Council of Churches because they felt that in making that deal, not only with Jews, but with anybody, really, any other groups really, making the deal of laying down the Great Commission was too great a price to pay to participate. So you had this bifurcation of thinking that was taking place within the Federal Council of Churches that actually resulted in a split from more evangelistic, more evangelical.
Mhm.
The space between evangelical and liberal churches was a much narrower space of difference between those two groups as now that has come to be a wider and wider rift.
Right.
Well, I don't know if
Good.
that answers your question, but that's what I'm responding to.
Great. Great. And one of the things that is noble about your book and one of our webinar participants raised is it seems like Roman Catholic participation is more subdued in some of these movements and some of these rallies and some of these events. Can you say more about Catholic presence and what's
Yes,
happening there?
that I'm glad you asked that because the the Catholics were marginalized in largely the same way the Jews were in in mainstream American culture at that time. Um, Michael Williams, the founding editor of Commonweal, was a prominent figure. Now he's one of the few. He is probably the most prominent Catholic spokesman. There is rally in 1934 called it's a courtroom drama that I go into. Fascinating, fascinating piece called "The Case again of Civilization Against Hitlerism," which was a very well planned out thing that was staged as a courtroom drama, which was a very popular genre of theatrical production at that time, where witnesses were called to prosecute the case against what was then called Hitlerism. And Michael Williams actually was the really a Catholic voice that for the first time way back in 1934 was saying as many as 1 million Jews could be killed in Europe as a result of this. Now, of course, we know that that number was multiplied 6 times, but no one was floating numbers like that. Michael Williams and also at the Hollywood Bowl produced this wonderful, wonderful playbill. It was like a almost the size of it. It was like a thick, like a magazine. And Jacques Maritain had a wonderful article because he was a prominent voice among prominent theologian voice among Catholics that explored the Jewish-Christian encounter in some depth. He had an excellent article in that. So yes, there was a Catholic presence, but you know, Wise was seeking the allies that he thought could do him the most good. And it was basically the mainline Protestants that he felt could do him the most good, and that evangelicals were actually quite marginalized at that time and more or less kept off. There was a man named Daniel Poling who was an exception to that rule. And he was someone that was a voice, an evangelical voice in basically a sea of either Jewish Zionists or else liberal Protestant mainline clergymen at that time.
Great, great. Yeah, we continue to welcome questions. A lot of people are simply thanking you for your work and your testimony. A question that occurred to me as germane to the book, on the flip side, is you seem to be part of the book is also a narrating of Jewish communal leadership and Jewish communal organizations, whether it's Stephen Wise or the American Jewish Committee versus the American Jewish Congress, for the various Zionist organizations that emerge. How do you think your book and the research you've done helps illustrate the development of Jewish institutional life in the first half of the 20th century?
Well, it's certainly one I think of the tragic elements, in the book. Jewish organizations were never able to achieve a united front in all of this time. Even during the worst moments, there were just there was too much internecine rivalry. Um, and of course, you had very differing attitudes towards Zionism at this time. They're not often remembered that, Reform Jews, for example, were deeply opposed to Zionism because they felt Zionism just played into the old trope that Jews can never really be one of us. They can't be good citizens because they have divided loyalties. And Zionism was a red flag that advertised that we have a divide to some people. We have a divided loyalty. We want to be Americans, but we have one eye cast over into the promised land. And this was this was thought to be very, very counterproductive. And of course, there were different kinds of Zionisms taking place also at that time. Do we get statehood? When do we get statehood? Do we get statehood? And so on and so forth.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we
Yeah,
we
to follow up on that, one of the really valuable things about your book is the way in which you bring in the Yiddish press. And can you just give us a little peel back of kind of the diversity that the Yiddish press reveals about Jewish life and responses to issues like Zionism, how to respond to Hitler, how to work with non-Jews?
well, ideological differences. I start out the book with my encounter with Sholem Asch, who wrote One Destiny, an epistle to the Christians, and was an I'd known the name Sholem Asch, but discovered he was a significant spokesperson for Jewish interests in America. The Nazarene came out in '39, was a bestseller. The re-Jewishing of the life of Jesus, and so forth. But he was one of Abraham Kahan's pets for 30 years when he wrote the Christian stuff. Kahn turned on him savagely. Kahn was the dictatorial editor of the Jewish Daily Forward. And one of the things you find in the English language press is you have Wise amplified and the Christian clergy amplified, and then a couple of paragraphs at the end of these lengthy articles, and it would say, and Ab Kahane of the Jewish Daily Forward spoke. Now, if you turn to the Jewish Daily Forward, the next day of the coverage, there's a big picture of Ab Kahane, on the front page. Ab Kahane speaks. So you have a whole different emphasis on the Jewish speakers, naturally, that are coming out of the Yiddish press. But the Yiddish press was very, very diverse. I bring up Sholem Asch because when Ab Kahane got rid of him, Asch just moved across the street to the Morgen Freiheit, which was the communist newspaper. The communist newspaper and the Yiddish newspaper were rivals. The socialist Yiddish forwards naturally was for an international movement of socialist Jews, and the communists were just giant promoters of the Soviet Union. That was one clash, and there were other such ideological clashes um, that were playing out as these different newspapers were throwing grenades at each other throughout the period.
This tracks with this kind of diversity, internal debates. You mentioned this debates around Zionism. Stephen Shore, who might be a relation of yours, I'm not sure.
No.
No, just a coincidence. Poses this question about kind of there's this you've move ahead to kind of questions around anti-Semitism today, questions of Israel, anti-Zionism, and this kind of this transformation of the image of the state of Israel from, you know, a David, so to speak, in 1948, using our webinar participants' words, to a Goliath now. You shows image of the playbill of a Jewish soldier with a Magen David on his helmet. There's this whole dynamic in here. Around with the last play production you discussed of the need for Israel to exist as a country or some kind of state for Jews. So can you say a little bit about how your book sort of anticipates some of the transformations and debates around what Israel ought to mean to the Jewish community going forward?
Yes. And I see that in the chat. Hello, Stephen Shore. Um, yes, he says part of the problem is that the image of Israel has changed from a Mideast David to a Mideast Goliath. Well, that's true, and that image has been shaped, in various ways by various skillful people who are able to make that claim. Well, one of the things we want to remember is much easier to like the Jews, feel sorry for the Jews, when they were marching into the gas chambers and didn't have the ability to defend themselves. They were styled as martyrs, even while American foreign policy didn't lift a finger to really help them. After the production of "We Will Never Die," Kurt Weill and Steve and Hecht had a talk, and well, did this actually do any good? And Kurt Weill's remark was, "Well, we made a lot of Jews cry," which was not a particularly hard thing to do at that time. So, because Israel has achieved the capability that it has and is now styled as a Mideast Goliath, it is harder for some people to remember their earlier sympathies for Jews. And we're seeing, I was just in Israel, and even within Israel, there's tremendous differences in what's going on right now. Um, I was at a rally in Tel Aviv. There were tens of thousands of people that were protesting the Netanyahu government, and you have people that were just as vociferously, defending it. So it's very, very complex and hard. One of the things that I find interesting is that Hopkins was right. The single most continuing, consistent relationship between Jews and Christians in this country now belong to the evangelical Christian Zionists and the Zionists of Israel that have found that by making common cause with American Zionists, that influence can be expanded.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's probably a good place to stop as we're coming close to the top of the hour. And I think that your presentation and our conversation shows that your book lays out the story of a decade in which a lot of the developments in Jewish-Christian relations after World War II are anticipated. The fault lines, the potential future alliances, some of the ongoing debates are all right there to see. So I do regard this book as a real contribution to our understanding of the uh, sort of the history of Jewish Christian relations prior to the Holocaust, which the United States needs to be studied further. So I really thank you for your contribution. I thank our webinar participants for being here. There will be a video that will go out um, probably next week for all of you to view and to share. And with that, also the discount code for the book and Alan Shore's email address if you want to reach out to him further.
Well, I want to say just one more brief thing, and it came from Yaakov Ariel, Israeli historian whose wheelhouse is the relationship between evangelicals and Jews. And he made a wonderful observation. He said, sometimes even in an arranged marriage, true love can blossom. And I'll stop there.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Alan, and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you very much.